So thanks for joining us. I know it's always hard to be the last grouping of the afternoon, and the only thing I'm really happy about is Charnetsky has opened the door for me to say almost anything that I want. So it's going to be a really candid panel. What I'm going to ask the panelists to do is each introduce themselves individually and give a little bit of context. Then I'm going to introduce myself a little more formally and set a little bit of context about what we're going to talk about, and then we're going to go back to the panelists with questions. So Dominic, why don't we start with you and move over this way in terms of introducing yourself.
Sure. So my name's Dominic Jaikaran. I'm the president and CEO of Bright Angel Therapeutics, a Toronto-based company developing new therapeutics to target antifungal resistance. The technology our company is based on is out of the Whitehead Institute for Biomedical Research in Boston, as well as the University of Toronto. In regards to my background, I'm a scientist by training. I did my PhD at U of T up the road, and then I moved to San Diego and worked for a biotech company called Diversa Corporation, which was one of the first directed evolution companies, and we discovered and evolved enzymes for various purposes. I then moved back to Canada, went to Rotman, got an MBA, and was lucky enough to get a job in venture, and I worked for Dennis Ho for BDC Life Sciences in the Toronto office for a couple of years. And it was there where I recognized I really wanted to build a company. So I joined Mars Innovation and was able to identify an opportunity that Leah Cowan was developing, and she's the chair of molecular genetics. And we were able to wrap a company around her technology, and Bright Angel Therapeutics was formed.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and thanks for sticking around. Thanks, Peter, for inviting me to participate in this panel, and to all the folks involved in putting this great day together. My name is Kathy Steiner, and I am a principal at Origin Merchant Partners. We are a Toronto-based investment bank specializing mainly in mergers and acquisitions advisory, as well as private placements and strategic investments. My focus is healthcare. I focus on mainly Canadian-based healthcare companies, and I help put them together with capital and with other companies that may be beneficial and synergistic. I've spent about the last 20 years, the better part of that time, as a healthcare banker. I led the healthcare group at Yorkton way back. I led the healthcare group at CIBC. I worked for a small boutique with a partner where we did a variety of strategy and growth consulting mandates and transactions. And now I've joined up with some of my old colleagues from CIBC at Origin. Thanks.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Steve Romanyshyn. I'm the president and CEO of Ontario Capital Growth Corporation. You might know us as OCGC. We're a government agency that we're essentially the venture capital arm of the province of Ontario. We participate as a limited partner in venture capital funds, and we also make some direct investments in innovative companies. The two sort of key objectives of OCGC is one, to grow and support the venture capital ecosystem in Ontario, and the second is to naturally get some money into the hands of these innovative, high potential, high growth companies. The sector focus is ICT, information communication technologies, clean tech, and life sciences. And we've made some significant investments over the last maybe 10 years or so. We've helped establish the Ontario Venture Capital Fund in 2008. We've moved forward with the federal government on some initiatives like the Northleaf Venture Capital Catalyst Fund. We've also made some investments in other funds that are smaller in size, but also have a great reach across Ontario, but also across Canada. We have assets under management probably just under $200 million. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Steve. Alison.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alison Nankivell, and I'm Vice President of Fund Investments and Global Scaling at BDC Capital, which is the risk capital subsidiary of the Business Development Bank of Canada. So, as some of you may know, BDC is the largest venture investor in Canada. We have a fairly large program of fund investing. That's the team that I run. We have 60-plus fund relationships in Canada, but include also cross-border and GPs who are working in multiple jurisdictions. We invest across sectors similar to Steve, life sciences certainly being a key one, as well as IT and clean tech, but also in between sectors, agri-tech, resource tech, a lot of areas where we see potential for new fund managers in Canada to develop interesting platforms that address sectors of technology growth that we think are promising in Canada. So we do a lot of heavy lifting of helping GPs create their funds in Canada. We have about $1 billion of assets under management on the indirect side, and as I said, we serve as a strong source of support for fund managers when they're looking to set up their funds from a point of view of governance, and helping to build critical mass of other LPs to come in and support those funds.
Thanks very much, Alison. And by the way, thank you, Steve and Alison. You're both LPs in our fund, so always appreciate it. I want to, for the people who don't understand how the venture ecosystem has evolved, I want to do a little bit of a historical walk for a second. Steve started kicking us off. I think back in 2008, governments across the country realized that we had a real fundamental problem in funding the venture ecosystem. And Ontario was actually one of the first to step up. The OVCF $205 million fund, in which the Ontario government committed $90 million, was really the first of these government initiatives to kick off, and it was, I think, a real enabler in terms of getting everyone else starting to think about it. That was followed relatively quickly in 2009 by Terralist's Fund of Funds. That was a $700 million fund. That fund got $200 million from the case, $250 million from the case, $250 million from the funds, which is a pension plan in Quebec, and they got another $200 million from the province. So that was a big fund that then came to play. Then in 2013, we had the Venture Capital Action Plan. That was the federal initiative in the same space. That plan put $400 million to work, and that got leveraged up with additional capital. So you had $1.3 billion going into the ecosystem. That money flowed mostly into fund of funds for different fund of funds. And you can see what the impact of that is. If you look back at 2012, there was about $1.5 billion deployed in about 400 different transactions. By 2017, that number was $3.8 billion, deployed into some 600 plus transactions, so significant growth. And then if you look by sector, if you look back to 2012, about 48% of that capital was going to IT, about 25% was going to healthcare. 2017, unfortunately, that number was now about 63% going into IT, about 19% going into healthcare, and healthcare had flattened out. It hit kind of $700 million of capital being deployed about 3 years ago, and it stayed pretty flat. And now in 2018, we've had about $2.4 billion invested year to date. And the really discouraging news is that 68% of that has gone to IT and 12% has gone to healthcare. So that's a real challenge, and it's part of what this panel is going to talk about. I think also when you look at how capital got deployed out of the Venture Capital Action Plan, again, I think it's been a fundamental enabler in venture capital, and I want to make sure everyone understands it. But the unfortunate part of that is only about 15% of that capital went to healthcare, and of that capital, less than half went to Canadian domiciled funds. In fact, the majority went to foreign funds. And so that's been one of the things that I think has had some implications, and we're going to talk about that today. So why don't I turn it over to the panel and give us, I've tried to set the big stage here in terms of what's happened in the funding ecosystem. Why don't you guys give us your own personal perspectives, what's happened over the last 5 years. Alison, you've been BDC's been a huge enabler in this ecosystem. Why don't we kick off with you?
Sure. Yeah, I think on the healthcare side, part of our challenge, and as you know well, Peter, has always been, trying to, when you're an indirect investor in a fund, you can only effectively respond to what the market's offering. And, I think many of us, as I said, including BDC, have spent quite a lot of time actually looking for talent and trying to bring some of that talent together and funding things that are out of the box as well, including, on the healthcare side, where we've been very early on involved in supporting accelerators and some other sort of, pre-company formation activity. But when it comes to funds, I think, we ourselves have struggled with trying to get the balance of both strategy for addressing what we think is the market need, and then getting the critical mass of LPs around that. Because we do know that we need certainly to have more focus of Canadian activity, but most of the funds that we see out there are at a minimum cross-border. and obviously are very focused on, when they're at the larger end of the market, are going to see and be attracted to larger deal flow coming out of the U.S. as opposed to Canada, where you have a much smaller pool of available companies to invest in. Obviously, when we have early stage strategy fund managers, we see more content of Canadian scale because there are more early stage companies. And I think we do struggle with that issue, as everybody does, as to, how do we allocate as investors, early stage versus late stage? How do we support so that those companies can grow through the phase to the later stage and then actually have the capital there to support it? As you well know, it's a limited number of institutional investors who actually invest in life science for a couple of reasons. One, I think, is it's not an area where institutional investors necessarily have a depth of expertise within their investment entities to be always making the right decisions on that. I think, secondly, it is a challenge within the Canadian ecosystem to make sure we see what is the company that's being formed, as opposed to a project or an initiative that might be then acquired. So for groups like us as a development bank, trying to struggle with, our goal is to create and try to see a scaled company in Canada created through the venture activity we support. Sometimes, I would say life sciences tends to be a bit more project R&D oriented, where we don't always see the creation of sustainable companies going forward, but rather, creation of products or creation of IP that then somebody takes forward. And that's sort of the struggles we deal with when we think about how to, support managers and support, dollars into that part of the innovation ecosystem versus others.
I'm going to come back at a couple of great points, so we're going to come back on that. Dominic, you're on the other side of the spectrum. You're a reformed VC now. So you've lived the VC side of the story. Now you're an entrepreneur trying to raise money. We were actually meeting and talking about this yesterday, and you were pitching us.
We were.
Talk about your last 5 years of experience and that transition and what you've seen in the ecosystem.
Yeah, so it's been different. I think it's been very beneficial having sat, in a VC's chair to understand what investors are looking for. So that bodes well, but I think there is not a lot of early stage money out there in the ecosystem. So it's very hard to get your first, say $5 million in a company to build value, when you really need that to build the investment rationale to raise a significant, I think, Series A investment. So I think that's one area that's very hard. Obviously, if I put on my VC hat, obviously, choosing what opportunities to invest in at the seed stage is also difficult, because you have to think about your investment timeline, where you are in your fund, and kind of what the exit will look like and what kind of return you can get on that investment. But
Dominic, if you put the 5-year lens on it, is it any easier today? Is it worse? Is it better? Any sense of that?
I think I think it's easier now. Look, I wasn't a CEO 5 years ago. I wasn't raising money 5 years ago. But I think, from my view, I think it might be a bit easier now than it was 5 years ago. I think there's more VC funds or more GPs with money in their funds to invest. So I think in that regard, yes, it's easier now than it was 5 years ago.
So Kathy, you've been doing this a long time. You have, and I mean that in a positive way. Give us a little bit of your perspective over the last 5-6 years.
Sure. I'll kind of look at the sector through the public market lens. And I would say it's probably still kind of the same. I think we've had some troughs and some peaks. I would say now we're probably in a bit of a trough in the public markets. I think, if you look at kind of 250 stocks in the S&P TSX capped index, I think the number is 53 of them are materials names, so mining stocks, that kind of thing. 16 of them are IT names, and wait for it, 8 of them are healthcare names. And of those 8, 3 are in the retirement residences business. 3 of them, of course, are in the cannabis space, and 2 of them are specialty pharma companies, Knight Pharma and Bosch. And so, I think what's really missing is, well, there's a lot of parts missing, because it does take a village to build a sector. There are a lot of moving parts. Capital, we always talk about capital and access to capital and availability of capital and all of that sort of stuff. Knowledgeable capital is, of course, important, but on top of that, human capital with experience and expertise and keeping those brains here in Canada is important to give investors the confidence that there's going to be success, opportunities for liquidity events. I mean, to be honest, I can't remember. I think there was probably a healthcare IPO in Canada last year, was it? Zymeworks. Wasn't that last year? But Clementia was in the U.S. They didn't go public here.
It's not a cross-border?
Maybe cross-border.
Cross-border.
And Zymeworks did go public. But those are both last year. There's been absolutely, and congratulations. Awesome. But, this year, I mean, the IPO window, I guess, is for all intents and purposes shut to healthcare and other sectors. And we got to post some good financial returns. So, I think we're missing a number of granddaddies to create that critical mass and excitement and just precedent, right? This is what we can do. And there are two. So, we need some more critical mass in the space.
Two companies by which we were also involved in our direct team.
Steve, your perspective, 5 years, evolution?
So I think there's probably a couple of different parts here, because I think that part of it is the attractiveness of the investment and life sciences. And I think there's a lot of sort of positive changes that have occurred over the last maybe 5 to 10 years. Part of it is the talent base here in Ontario, especially in the areas sort of STEMs or life sciences. We talked, I think, this morning about the number, I think, 24 academic research institutions with strengths in cancer, stem cells, diagnostic imaging, neurosciences. So there's other investments that have been made that allow for a better ability for companies to start. When you talk about stuff like J-Labs, you have 40,000 square feet of a facility to support 50 startups. You have a little bit of venture capital money that's been provided by governments. So I think that that's essentially what's helped to create a bit of a market. So the next piece is like to attract the capital. And I think that, similar like in ICT, I think life sciences is at the point where I think we're getting a little bit more attention globally. And I think that the hope is that it'll continue to attract maybe talent, but it'll also attract capital as well. And so you do have certain stages, whether you talk about early stages, late stages, and some might do better than others. But I think it's the signs are fairly positive, with the exception of your point earlier about the latest data on venture capital in life sciences is down substantially.
So Kathy, I want to throw this question over to you. Probably the most dynamic growth sector of life sciences over the last 5 years has been cannabis. Has that sucked all the air out of the room?
Absolutely. I mean, it's unbelievable, right? So both from an institutional and a retail investor perspective, I think just year to date in Canada, I think they've raised, cannabis cultivators have raised something like, I don't know, $7, $8, $9 billion. I guess on the positive, if they're able to take profits, they can recycle it back into, sort of a broader base of investments. But, it sucked the air out of the market in general. My partner who covers, mining stocks is also kind of complaining. And it's just been a very interesting dynamic. So, yes.
So, Alison, you alluded to something around sort of some of the challenges in terms of investors understanding the space and their engagement. I was looking at your numbers this morning. Healthcare's been one of your better performers. I think your healthcare portfolio has meaningfully outperformed your IT portfolio. I'm not surprised, because IT, if you look at IT spending globally, it's flat. If you look at everything else related to our business, whether it's Medicare spending, whether it's the emergence of China, whether it's growth in pharma sales, looking over at Mark, we've seen 5% CAGR on pharma sales, spending on healthcare in this province, averaging about 4 point something in terms of growth. So every single thing in healthcare is up. Everything in IT is flat, and yet we see this big disconnect on investment dollars. And your performance, like many of the healthcare funds, is really good. Why that disconnect? When you have great performance, why are we getting this disconnect on capital allocation?
Well, I think that's one way to slice the numbers. I mean, I think in IT.
What's your numbers? I just looked at them.
I agree that, we have, first of all, a significantly much larger IT portfolio than a healthcare. Our healthcare portfolio's performance is dominated significantly by our two companies we just mentioned, Zymeworks and Clementia, which have done very well from a listing perspective. So that's a skewing of a small pool of companies versus a very large, broad base of IT companies, many of which are early stage and still very much in the J curve, and hence haven't seen a market valuation rise, because we have probably much more early IT exposure than we do in healthcare. Secondly, I would say that, I think we have to think about healthcare differently. I actually come from a private equity background. When I came into BDC, I'd been Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, and before that EDC, and doing all international work. And I can tell you that healthcare as a concept is a huge business for private equity, buyout, and let's not forget the IT side of healthcare, right? Which is going really, really well. And in fact, Canada is so strong in data analytics and AI that the healthcare side of this is going to be huge if we can get the data pieces to work with the AI capabilities, which I'm sure many of you as experts in this audience know way more about it than me. But healthcare as a theme is going to be very popular for a long time and be hugely profitable. So let's not mistake biotech as the only way to play this, because it is a very specific kind of appetite of investment, the kind that needs the most expertise on the part of investors. I would also say my observation is that, to the earlier point about number of investors, what the U.S. benefits from greatly, as you well know, Peter, is endowments, foundations, universities. There is this huge breadth of investors in the U.S. that we don't have here, who have deep expertise and commitment to funding healthcare, right? In a way that we don't have that range of institutional investors. And that really shortchanges us in terms of getting that visibility of our sector, of our companies, of our GPs, to look more seriously at working, and collaborating alongside the institutional investors in Canada, right? Including it, and as you know well, from as well as Asia, right? That's the other place we need to spend more time trying to see more corporates, because we don't have the large corporates, and we don't have the the diversity of institutional investors that really what you see in the biotech investing space.
So let's pick up on that. And I think the foundation endowment one is a really interesting one, because it is actually completely lacking in this country, and I think that's a not trivial issue. I mean, we had on a couple of the earlier panelists people who represent not-for-profits that are obviously engaged in raising capital from stakeholders to drive patient change. Yet we've just started to see some legislation making some of that a little bit more user-friendly for some of these not-for-profits to think about engaging in the space, but I don't think we've seen anything meaningful happen. Do you think there's something we can do systemically, and maybe I'll start with you, but I'll kick this across, to think about how we engage what is a fairly sophisticated, totally aligned stakeholder in becoming a bigger player in the ecosystem?
Well, I mean, I think others here have more to say on it, I'm sure, than me, who, especially Kathy, if she's fundraising for a lot of these companies. But I guess my observation is we simply don't register as a market in a lot of other jurisdictions, right? We just don't have any visibility. Yep. We're not marketed. There's not a compelling narrative that can summarize clearly what the offering or the capabilities in Canada are. I think that's always the problem. Is doing it in a way that investors are intrigued or see it enough of a market to spend time in it, as opposed to seeing it as an adjunct to the U.S. market.
Yeah, we'll come back to that one. Steve, any comments, thoughts on how you engage maybe some other stakeholders? I mean, again, I know that you guys, when you did the OVCF, part of that was all around bringing other stakeholders into the ecosystem. We've seen some of those, stakeholders go deeper, like OMERS actually go deeper after being a partner with you. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that some of the things that we're doing now, I think, will help. In particular, some of the initiatives that the federal government is undertaking. In particular, I'm thinking about VICI, which is the Venture Capital Catalyst Initiative, which essentially provides some additional incentives for investors, institutional players to participate in the venture capital space. Essentially, it provides some ability to reduce the risk of their investment. So I think that those type of programs are important. I think that just to touch on what Alison spoke about marketing, I think that we don't do a very good job. And again, people probably heard this before. We're Canadians, so we don't like to boast about our successes. But I think we do have some really strong areas where we have some strengths, and in the life sciences space, combined with some of those like in AI and data analytics. And you see there are a lot more opportunities, I think, combining the life sciences space with more of that sort of ICT space. So I think that we need to market ourselves a little bit better, because I think that we're an opportunity that is untouched. And I think that, and again, you're starting to see it a little bit, because you start seeing some of these companies or these venture capitalists and capital coming from the States. You see it a little bit from China. You see it a little bit from the Middle East as well. So I think that that's kind of a simple thing that we can do to sort of attract more investors, whether institutional investors or just broadly all investors.
If you read the data recently, if you look at the venture ecosystem in the U.S., 40% of capital, or 40% of deals last year had a Chinese investor. That's not true in Canada by a long shot. There's been some new legislation that's been put in place in the U.S. that now, when you bring an Asian, or in fact any foreign investor, including a Canadian in this case, and into a transaction, you have to register the transaction, and it has to go through a review process. Do you guys think that's an opportunity for Canada? Do you think that the U.S. making these kinds of decisions around how they engage with foreign investors is an opportunity for us to engage more broadly in the world and talk about access to North America and Canadian innovation here without some of these overlayers? Dominic, maybe I'll throw that over to you.
I think it could be, just because, in the past, when there's been legislation in the U.S. that has inhibited or prevented, stem cell research in California, Canada became a hotbed for stem cell research. So I think there is an opportunity for attracting some Chinese money there. I think, one thing, kind of moving away from the Chinese investment and coming back to alternative investors in the ecosystem, I think foundations are starting to play a bigger role. So Bill and Melinda Gates, as we know, are very involved. The Wellcome Trust is very much involved, and are actually LPs in CARB-X, which is a big initiative funding technologies in the antibacterial space, and some in the antifungal space. So I think there's our non-traditional LPs in that. I guess they're more or less philanthropic donors to CARB-X. They're not LPs because it's not a traditional fund, and there's various impact funds as well, kind of out of foundation. So the Novo Foundation in Denmark is one that's kind of investing globally for the best opportunities. So I think if we get away from Canada a little bit and think more or less we have to build world-class opportunities, then I think the money will come, and we stop focusing on just Canada and we focused in Canada at building globally competitive opportunities. Then I think we'll be all right.
Kathy, comments on that? Thoughts?
Yeah, it's funny, in thinking about the conversation today, it kind of dawned on me that the current American administration could actually be a real great thing for the Canadian life sciences space. And, while I was coming downtown today on the subway, I was talking to a woman from South Carolina who was working on University Ave, and, she was pleased to be here and, remarked that she didn't realize how much Canadians do right. So, I think there could be some interesting opportunities arising out of that in terms of, just drawing on more global collaborations and investments. And I also just wanted to pick up on Steve's point. Sorry, now I'm good. Sorry, I may have lost the thread. It'll come back.
Do you want us to get back on that one?
Pardon?
Do you want us to come back to that one?
Yes, please.
If it was negative, I don't want to hear it, but if it was positive, yes.
Fair enough.
Oh no, as he was talking about the things that we do well, AI, med tech, it also kind of dawned on me that maybe we just can't do everything well. We're a small country. We work really well in sort of these overlapping spaces. Our universities kind of thrive in those areas of putting, interesting disciplines together. And maybe that's where, not to sort of disparage some of these other, sort of subsectors in life sciences, but maybe, there are some areas we really ought to be focused on for excellence in life sciences.
My list wasn't that long, but
But, I think
but they're
there's a
important
lot of
areas. It's
opportunity.
important areas that I think really there are opportunities. And I think we do have those strengths. And as I said before, I think that there's a need to sort of promote and market some of that, I think, to get that attention. I think that, like I said, you see it in the ICT sort of sector, and I think that it can happen in the life sciences sector.
And let's, of course, not forget cannabis. It's the U.S. federal laws that have sort of enabled the Canadian space to thrive and grow. And, we're talking about a $6+ billion market in Canada. I think I read something about a $65 billion market in the U.S. I mean, it sort of dwarfs any generic and certainly any blockbuster that we've seen. So, let's not forget that, our excellence there.
So a couple panelists have alluded to sort of, I think, the perceptions, investors' capabilities to understand the space and some of the perceptions around the space. I think there are actually a lot of misconceptions. So one of the big misconceptions that everyone hears about is, it's harder to build a life sciences company than it is an IT company. Well, the data just doesn't show that that's true. There are more failures on the IT side than there are actually on the life sciences side. I think there's lots of misconceptions around the time to value. So again, when you read the data or when you read people's perceptions, people talk about it's longer term to get to a liquidity event on the life sciences side than is it on the IT side. And again, the data doesn't support that at all either. I think one of the things, and I'd be interested in the panel's comments on this, is we're probably in the only industry where the big players deliver a really interesting message. So think about it. You're going to go watch a new Disney movie, and you go to the movie, and you expect to pay $16. But you go to this movie, and it's priced at $32. And you say to yourself, how can that be? And what do they say? Well, our last 3 movies failed, so I'm going to bundle all the costs together, and now to come see this new Disney movie, it's going to be $32. Now, you've never heard Disney do that, and you've never heard IBM do that, and you've never heard anyone else do that. But it's one of the things that, unfortunately, drives a misconception about how much it costs to build products in our space. So one of our peer group firms out of California, Sofinova, just did some interesting research following companies in their portfolio from cradle to grave in terms of how much it costs to build a company from early stage all the way to the market. And their cost curve went from 100 million to 500 million. Not the 1 to 4 billion you constantly hear quoted by big pharma, right? And so the reality is what we've seen is a fundamental shift in the ecosystem now where capital is being allocated into our ecosystem to allow innovator companies to actually build companies and for pharma companies to acquire those companies. That's a pretty big shift. And when you see what's happened at the regulatory side, we've seen about 60 products, 55 to 60 products approved in every one of the last 3 or 4 years. And if you look at the origin of those products, roughly 70% have come from outside of pharma. So they're either in-licensed or acquired. And so we've seen this really fundamental shift. Talk about misconceptions around our industry, the impact that has on investor engagement, and what we can do to change that. Dominic, I'm going to throw it over to you because you're living it.
Well, look, the misconception that, I think the length of time that it takes to develop a product is, I think that's I think it's a misconception, but I think it's a little bit on the other side. So as a venture capitalist, Peter, if you come in, a company pitches you, they think they can get to exit in 5 years, but really, it's 12 years, it's 15 years. So I think that's a big, flipping the question on its end. I think that's a big misconception. Or, if I'm looking for seed investment, but I know it's going to take a long time to get to an exit. So, I can't, basically pitch it saying, 5 years, we'll be sold, you'll get your money back. Or you have these government-funded accelerators that are, investing at the seed stage and saying they're going to exit in 4 years and become sustainable. There's that kind of misconception out there that, if you think about it, it's never going to happen, but it's perpetrated throughout these organizations who have to say that to the funders who, accept it, and then it's just, to me, it's just a little bit insane. So I think, from that side, people are accepting, facts that they know to be false when, really, I think it takes 12 to 15 years.
So does that mean the first 8 years has to be funded in a different way, or the first 6 years has to be funded in a fundamentally different way?
Yeah, I think maybe. I think we maybe have to rethink how seed investment happens, and perhaps the government takes some risk there, or perhaps we bring in foundations, or we rethink kind of how that works in Canada. In the U.S. you have these venture funds that are Atlas or Third Rock or Flagship or Versant. They come in and they're not really funding companies; they're starting companies. So they're going in, they're reading the papers, coming up with the idea, forming the companies with the KOLs, and then they're kind of funding it from cradle to grave. And when the public markets are open, that's fantastic. So you can start a CRISPR company, 4 years later IPO it, and you're nowhere near to market, nowhere near for your drug hitting the market. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about 12 years.
Right, but what the U.S. markets have figured out how to do well is to move things up the risk curve and get different funders at different levels of that ecosystem engagement, right? And again, I think that's still the challenge for Canadian companies. Is again, most IPOs and public offerings for healthcare companies aren't liquidity events as standalone events. Mm-hmm. They're really financing events on the pathway to creating more value, but you raise the capital at a much lower cost of capital than it would if it came from a guy like me. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the challenge that we still have to figure out, right? Okay, so I'm hearing a lot of challenges. From our panelists. So let's talk about what do we do? How do we go forward? What are the recommendations? What are the thought processes that we need to put in place to go from challenge to opportunity? I mean, again, I think we hear it every day. Fantastic science going on here. We see it everywhere we go. Every time I go into one of the academic institutions, and we've partnered with 12 healthcare foundations across the country, every time I visit them, every time I meet with their innovators, we're seeing fantastic science. I think we are seeing more companies being built here. Clementia is a great example. Zymeworks is a great example. These are the first significant new generation companies in Canada. Rennie, another company in our portfolio, is exactly in that same ilk, and we'll have phase 3 data. It could be a new treatment for lupus nephritis coming down the pipe in less than a year. So these are big changes. And maybe to Steve's point, I'm not sure that we're advertising that nearly as well as we should, and I'm not sure that most people understand that. What can we do to change that paradigm? Kathy, you're a marketer. You're in sales. What can we do to change that?
So, it's interesting because, I think the Canadian market and Canadian investors are very accustomed to taking risk, right? Investing in a mine and an exploration project in oil and gas. I mean, it's a bet as much as anything else. Sure, the timeline might be different. There's some different dynamics around healthcare, but we are not risk averse, I would say, when it comes to where we're going to write a check and where we're going to make a bet. So I think some of it is exactly how we want to position it, right? I think if we want to sort of explain the complexities of payers and patients and doctors and users and insurance, I think, I start to gloss over. And really that doesn't, I think, so, to answer your question, I think there just needs to be an appreciation for how that risk and value curve moves along the continuum. A product doesn't need to get to commercial in order to get the big payback. There's lots of value created along the way. And frankly, I've seen a lot of public companies where, I've said, oh man, that clinical trial isn't going to, this is, there's a million problems with this story. But the day of reckoning is so far out that it just doesn't matter. So, some of these problems can actually be kind of, can work to your advantage. So I think it is sort of a bit of spin.
Dominic, you're spinning right now every day. How are you spinning?
Sorry.
I don't know. How are you mean? Sorry, how are you communicating? What do you think we have to do to get people to engage in your kind of company and get excited and understand the opportunity set that's going on in this province and in this country, frankly? It's not just a provincial thing, it's a country thing. Yeah, I think there are a lot of positives, actually.
No, definitely. Like, look, for me, what we're trying to do is, explain what we're trying to do, and we're really trying to, solve an unmet medical need. It's a huge problem. It's recognized. It's growing. So we're trying to communicate that, and also communicate kind of our solution, which we think is world class and has huge potential, with a competitive advantage. So really telling the story on how we're going to solve a huge global problem. And part of that is a partnership with Schrödinger, which is a computer-based drug discovery company in New York. So they're really going to help us, solve the critical problem in developing new antifungal drugs, which is coming up with fungal-specific molecules. So it's really telling the story on how we're going to solve this big global problem. That's how we're trying to communicate and get, money around the opportunity. And we have raised, roughly a little over $1 million to get started and push things forward.
Is there a differential role in this country for the big pharma partners, the big med tech partners to play? And maybe I'll ask this of Steve and Alison. We've just recently signed a new free trade agreement. That new free trade agreement has extended the patent life for biologics. That is a huge win for a select group of companies. I don't think the government extracted a quid from industry for that big win. Thoughts? Alison, you're smiling, so I'm going to let you answer that question.
No, I was just thinking that's a sensitive one. I mean, it's obviously, listen, I think large corporates in the biotech space should absolutely be more engaged here, and have a great foundation of early stage companies IP to work with. To the point of attracting a broader range of players, I think there's a select, we were lucky at J Labs, Pfizer, others, but it's just, I think we could double the number who are actually engaged in this market. I suspect there's probably some work to be done between the sort of participants in the community looking for that funding and some of the government agencies who are involved in investment attraction. I mean, Invest in Canada, we have this new hub. I'm not sure to what extent they're looking at this issue of biotech. We've had, obviously, as I'm sure you know, previous false starts on trying to get people to set up and have significant presence as biotechs entities here. I'm not so sure it's just that you need that, but you need money here, and you need some kind of presence of these groups. And how we can think more creatively about that, I think, is worthwhile. But it seems to me, too, I think some of the earlier comments is we're still missing critical mass and all the pieces of the cluster, right? And I think we're getting closer to having that in certain parts of IT, with many groups like Google and Facebook, and I mean they all have campuses, they all have offices here. They're in Waterloo, they're in Toronto, they're everybody's expanding to get the talent they need. We need to have a critical mass like that happen in recognition of talent in the life sciences sector. And where we're missing pieces of it, I think we have to think creatively about how, as government, private sector, research, etc., to attract that and fill that gap.
Steve?
Well, I guess to your point about extension of protection, whether there's quid pro quo or not, I actually thought you're looking at from another perspective of like other initiatives, whether it's like flow-through shares or angel investor tax credits.
I'm happy to talk about those too. So.
But I think that in itself should spur a little bit more investment, because it provides a greater opportunity. So the business case just got improved, I think. So, coupled with, the trends that you see with the big pharmas, they're outsourcing, they're setting up consortia. So the hope is that that might, again, spur additional opportunities. It might spur additional investment in that space. So again, I'm not sure what the exact follow-up is going to be, whether it's just a question of raking in more cash or whether it'll actually create an incentive to make that investment, but I'm hoping it's the latter.
So when we look across the Canadian landscape, one of the models that we really like is what BC has done, where they have investment tax credits for individual investors who participate in innovation companies, particularly in healthcare companies, but broadly in innovation companies. And the person who writes the check gets a tax credit on day one. Companies like Zymeworks and Aurinia, many of the companies we look at in the BC market, have been significant beneficiaries of that capital. And it is one of the things that I think the government can start to look at, I think, and it's a relatively low-cost way to engage. And I think what it does is it does more than engage capital. It engages smart people who are aligned with a positive outcome. And I think that's also part of building a good ecosystem. It's not just about money. Money never gets you to the place. Otherwise, lotteries would be fantastic things and everyone would be happy. But the reality is, I think building companies is all about getting smart people engaged. And we've seen in BC that that's worked really well. And I think BC has one of the most vibrant early stage innovation markets, largely as a function of that. And it gets the guys who've built companies, even in other sectors like IT, to actually stay in the market and re-engage pretty steadily. It does have some implications on pricing. People are less sensitive to pricing when they do their rounds, or the investors are less sensitive to pricing. But again, we've seen that as a key enabler. Other things that you guys might have seen across the country or outside the country that excites you in terms of models and initiatives to help engage capital? Cap?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, what do you think?
Nope.
Oh, no, just, I mean, all related to sort of tax incentives and, I mean, really just encouraging behavior that's beneficial to job creation and creation of IP and all that sort of stuff. So, deferral of capital gains or, I think Massachusetts has a program where they'll, there's a credit if for companies who are going to hire at least 10 employees for the next, I think it's 4 years. And, so things that encourage the behaviors, I think, the government sort of needs to.
Dominic, I mean, you've seen that,
Yeah, there's one program. So I think, in Canada, we're great at doing basic research. I don't think anyone can disagree with that. But I think where we really fall down is translational research. And, they call it commercialization. I like to call it translational research. And we're not alone. In New York, they recognize that is a big problem. And they started this organization called the TRI-ITDI, which is the Tri-Institutional Drug Discovery something. I can't nail the acronym right now, but it's bringing Wuxi in there. It's bringing Schrodinger and Charles River in Takeda, kind of in providing expertise. Takeda has loaned some medicinal chemists to try to help, develop programs that are being developed at Rockefeller, Memorial Sloan Kettering, and Cornell. So basically, projects are coming out of those institutions. Those organizations are helping them kind of develop development plans. They're executing them. And then Deerfield and Bay City Capital formed Bridge Medicine to then fund those through clinical trials. So they've really kind of helping the translational piece. So I think, we have to, admit and come to terms with it that we're not very good at translational medicine. So let's bring that expertise to Canada. It doesn't have to be in Toronto, although I would like it to be. And then kind of bring partners around the table. And partners are excited and willing to do it. I've spoken to a number of them on various initiatives. So I think, that could be a way to try to, develop the science as well as bringing money to the table.
Yeah, one thing I think is observation from what we see in tech is, I think that's a really good point, is that I actually think we just have to find different ways of bringing different partners together. One of the things we've noticed from very early ecosystem work we've supported is that it's often coming out of just different models. Like, we were very early supporters for things like creative destruction labs, which is now, as you know, across the country, including in the healthcare space at UBC. I actually think that there is something to be said to possibly seeing how you can bring cross-disciplinary activity in this space together between IT and biotech in a kind of platform like a CDL to accelerate for a couple of reasons. One is you're probably going to get a broader range of mentors to work with these companies to help with the commercialization who may not primarily come out of healthcare, but actually have a lot of skills in building companies and building business models that can be helpful. The second is that I do think that a lot of the advancements that are going to happen it's just my sense in healthcare, are going to be more cross-disciplinary going forward because, innovation will involve, IT and analytics will be such a core part of, saving wrong decisions or energy or time or expenses, that has to be so integrated early into the thinking of how we develop new forms of healthcare and medicine that, getting that going in a platform of company creation or a platform where we can all experiment together, I think would be helpful to try to jumpstart some of these things. And I mean, we'd love to see people come instead of with, the same old accelerator thing. Who's coming prepared to bring like-minded but people from different disciplines together? Because I think that would be really helpful.
So I think that's a great maybe spot to end on. I think that's a great comment, and maybe to open it up for questions. Of course.
So we talked a little bit about some of the solutions. Access to capital is one of these topics that we talk about at every one of these sessions in life sciences. And over the years, I've heard a number of policy initiatives spoken about. We talked about angel investor tax credits, like what they have in BC. Flow-through shares was mentioned. Some of the other ones that have come up are things like SBIR type programs in the U.S. With all the initiatives that we talk about, mandated pension funds is another one. Are there specific ones that you have heard or examples in other jurisdictions where you think could fundamentally work really well in this space, in this environment in Ontario? And if you had to pick one, what would it be?
Yeah, I've already picked mine. I think the BC tax credit program is the most effective one I've seen. It's easy to employ. It drives real capital engagement. It drives great mentor engagement. It's relatively low cost to the government because they make up for it in spades just by the employment component as these companies scale. It keeps those companies anchored in their local markets because they have lots of local investors engaged in the company, so they don't have a predilection to go pick up their bags and go to California. So I think it's the most reproducible, lowest cost model, and one of the most effective ones I've seen. But that. So
I'd agree with Peter with one sort of aspect of his comments, which is, like you said, it was easy to employ.
I'm a private sector guy. I get to say stuff like that.
Because having, from a government perspective, I think having worked at the Ministry of Finance, the angel tax credit comes up used to come up all the time. And the one thing that always kills it is that you're giving a credit to rich people. And so it's very difficult to implement.
Who are employing university graduates and highly educated and creating jobs in their ecosystem.
Just the politics around it, it's just too difficult. And to be honest, I think that even with the new sort of Ontario government, the government of the people, I think it would be hard. I think that they are, to be honest, I think they are looking at it. But that's what's killed in the past, is that it's perceived as a credit for rich people. But I agree with everything else.
Anyone else have a jurisdiction or an example of something they think that's been really effective?
I don't know if I have a jurisdiction, but as I said kind of in my earlier comment about CDL, if you see why people congregate around something, it's because somebody with a formidable reputation or somebody who has come with a track record or just a different take starts something and everybody gets excited about it. It's interesting. I always say this, I shouldn't say this publicly, I don't know if there's press in the room, but most investors and most stuff in life with regard to investment are people like to follow, they don't like to lead, right? They like to follow who they think are the most thoughtful people. So having really significant influencers lead something different will attract a lot of capital. So I think finding somebody to sort of be that galvanizing, vision for something, there's no shortage of capital in the world. There's tons of capital looking for the right idea, but they have to have their imagination captured by what the vision is and who the people who are behind it are being credible. So finding people who can do that in healthcare, I think would be a really good start. And it's probably light. getting somebody who's coming from a different take, or, you know, a combination, like I said, of maybe non-healthcare and some healthcare people. The same way if Bill Gates stands up and says, I'm gonna do this, a lot of other money comes around the table with Bill Gates, right? So I think there's probably things like that
But
that
do
we
you
can
think
think
that's what
about.
kicked off the IT sector?
I think IT was just sheer economics, of the fact that there was a lot of early exits at certain stages of the cycle, because there's a lot of large IT corporates who acquire companies. And, you know, there's just a lot of IT service companies that can grow into being professional companies without being blockbuster hits that actually make money.
Yeah, so there's a lot, so that's one differential. You can build
You can
software
just build
and
a
sell.
service
Yeah,
company,
you can build a
right?
service company initially and leverage that as part of the growth plan, right? So that allows you, yeah, good point. Connor?
Peter, what do you think of the CPRIT program?
Well, look, it's been a huge enabler, right? I mean, there's a lot of Canadian, so for those of you who don't know the program, it's a Texas-based program that provides fairly substantive grants for companies that commit to doing some of their innovation in the Texas environment. I think it's all around cancer, right?
It's a cancer prevention,
Yeah, it's cancer.
research, and
It's 100%
yeah.
cancer-oriented program. I think there's at least 3 Canadian companies, maybe more,
Yep.
that have gotten anywhere from 10 to 15. I think a couple now are north of $20 million of capital. It's meant those Canadian companies have had to set up some of their operations, but not all of their operations. I think it's built a real ecosystem in the Texas environment now that's starting to gain some critical mass. So it's worked. It was a huge capital commitment on the part of
Yes.
the jurisdiction, and again, I think that's the reality of these programs. If you see what's happening in Boston or in New York, I think New York's just re-upped with $500 million of capital for innovative companies. So again, I think those programs can work if they're well executed, and they really got the ecosystem to be involved in validating those opportunities, and the KOLs involved in the process. And again, like I said, there's been a number of Canadian companies who've leveraged that really nicely. So I'm a fan, but coming back to Steve's point,
To replicate it,
yeah, there's a lot of capital that's
Sure.
needed to be deployed to make that happen. Other questions? Sorry, did I hear? Yeah.
I had a comment and question. I really like the idea of bringing a multidisciplinary, cross-sectoral perspective to some of this. I think that could be really interesting, and also the idea of platforms. One of the things that I would observe is that we talk about a lot of things based on anecdotes about, examples of things that work or don't work, but we don't actually apply much rigorous analysis to where we have tried things, where we have invested money. So all of us have experience with one accelerator or another accelerator. I'm sort of peripheral to your sector, but I wondered if people could comment on things like the Centre for Drug Research and Development in BC, because some people have said that works, or Mars, or how would we know what works and what doesn't work if there's never any real evaluation or accountability built into these government investments? Because I do think that accountability piece, for especially where you're asking for public sector funds, is really important. And I haven't seen a lot of evidence that we have fact-based assessments of what works and what doesn't work to achieve what you want to achieve. Wondering if someone can comment on that.
That's a great question. Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I'll provide a few thoughts just
Yeah.
around, you brought up, I think, Mars. I don't know all the financial data, but because we were, as part of my old job, we were doing a review of Ontario's sort of innovation sort of ecosystem, looking at accelerators, incubators, and that sort. And it was kind of interesting to look at Mars, because Mars was one of the ones that, and this is kind of a bit of a criticism of government, not sure whether we want to have control of Mars and provide some specific directions of what they sort of achieve, or we want them to be self-sustaining. And they were really going down that route of being sort of self-sustaining. And to me, that's an example of some success. Also, even just within Mars, there are programs like the IAF, which is essentially their venture capital group that's focused more on seed investments. They make money, so to me, that's another sort of positive point to show that some of these programs are successful.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we did a fair amount of accessing and working with a number of accelerator platforms. I don't think, it wasn't our job to be, I think, creating a public review. We aren't government, we're a crown corporation, but we did have different experiences in different accelerators. I'd say the biggest problem we had, and we have with a lot of organizations around this, is that they're sort of self-perpetuating, right? So regardless of whether they're successful or not, they feel like they need to survive and grow their business empire. So a lot of them, and usually one replicates another and another and another, and then it becomes, you have so many of the same sort of things, you can't also get critical mass, right? Because there's, like, every university wants their accelerator, or every municipality wants their accelerator, and so this is part of the problem of Canada. We actually we're thin on resources, and we spread them too thinly anyways, because everybody wants to have their own horse in the game, right? Or the race, whatever. Sorry, mixing my metaphors. But, that's, I think, the challenge we face. Whereas I think, I think some of the efforts we were trying to do with the clusters, the government's super cluster initiative, is to acknowledge a desire to create one area where we could try to create critical mass, instead of everybody have digital media, everybody have AI, everybody have, protein clusters or whatever it is. And I think maybe we need to think more about that as we go forward in this, in the biotech and the healthcare space as well.
Yeah, and I think, just to pick up on that a little bit, I mean, the venture business as a whole went through this, and I think the one thing that the governments, federal and provincial, did really well was they actually made sure that everyone who got funded was performance-based.
Right.
There was no economic development strategy, there was no regional development strategy, there was no sector development strategy. It was all about performance and the opportunity to drive real returns in the Canadian ecosystem. And I think that that's resulted in Canadian VCs as a whole now being a much better generation of firms, because that's been the test, not other stuff.
And can I just add just one point?
Yeah,
so that was how the identification of funds, but also on the other end, on the outcomes too, is BDC has a dividend policy, so they actually write a check to the government, so they're making money. Similarly with OCGC, is that we're not losing money. So I think that that's another point to make, is that it's not like we're subsidizing these funds and these fund managers, and they in turn are putting money in companies, and those companies are failing. They're actually succeeding, and that means that OCGC and BDC is making money.
So I just want to go back to the comments around tax credits, and I absolutely get sort of the political challenges that exist with trying to make that happen. But I would suggest that if there's ever a time to actually find a way to reposition that in a different way, to have a conversation with this government about it. One of the comments I made this morning is around, if you actually look at one of the most important sources of funding for that basic research and the applied research that's happening in hospitals in Ontario, biggest component of that is actually philanthropic dollars. And so the idea of being able to talk about how do we create the same situation upstream in terms of or downstream, the other components of it, as part of that conversation. I think there's a real opportunity to have a different conversation about that.
Yeah, and the other thing tied to that, I think everyone gets focused on the mega deals, right? The $100 million deals and all that stuff. But when you look at the data and you dive into the data, 75% of all deals are under $5 million, right? That's really where innovation gets funded, with lots of checks between, $500,000 and $5 million. The press loves, and politicians love the $100 million deals where they can stand on a podium and talk about them. Those companies aren't changing the ecosystem, right? It's the companies, it's all those other companies. It's those 300 companies that got funded in the last quarter with checks less than $5 million that are doing the things to move them to the next step that will allow them to attract hopefully $10 or $15 million to go down that value chain, that you have to think about how you engage. And that's why I do think things like incentive programs that allow and enable small checks to be written by people who care and are passionate, and it ties into foundations as well, I think is a really important part of the ecosystem. And we look at the fund that we've just finished raising, or just in the process of closing out. Almost a third of our money now comes from family offices and people who care about the ecosystem. And that's a complete change from our last fund where it was all institutional capital, right? And so the more you can induce people to put their passion and their money together to achieve things, I think that's a real win. Other questions?
I'd like to follow up on that prior comment that, and I'd love to be corrected in this, but my understanding with regards to the CRA rules, of course, in Canada, is that philanthropic charitable organizations cannot make investments in for-profit entities. This is something they're allowed to do in the United States. So you have situations like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation supporting Vertex's development of a drug, which I understand they cashed out at 3x. So kids get a drug, a company gets a lifeline, and a foundation gets a chance to see their dollars in a very meaningful and understandable way put into doing some great work. And the fact that my best understanding is we're barred from doing that in Canada seems like a real shortfall. High net worth individuals can get their names put on the sides of buildings, but they can't help to create a drug for kids.
Yeah, so CF1 is a great example. That foundation is now worth $3.5 billion. It's actually at risk of losing its not-for-profit status because it has to actually donate $200 million a year. And so we have a company in that space, and they're likely to have their entire phase 3 clinical program funded by the foundation. I think actually the rules have changed, and I think foundations can invest in limited partnerships and things like that. The problem has been, when you look at the governance of these foundations, most of the people who sit on the governance committees and the audit committees of the foundations think their fiduciary duty is to preserve capital. And so they don't think of the double bottom line. And that's the challenge. So they invest in mutual funds, in T-bills and whatever, preserve the capital, and then have that capital go off to the foundation or go off to do whatever else. They're not thinking about that double bottom line agenda. We've had a lot of these conversations with foundations over the last couple of years. I think more of them are starting to think about it, but the problem is their boards are extraordinarily conservative, and they haven't got this yet.
This is an absolutely fascinating discussion, and there are a couple of things that really struck me. Alison, you said that there's no shortage of capital, and I think that's bang on, and you talked about the influencers and reputation and track record. I look at the whole cannabis thing, and the comment about it sucking the air out. There's got to be some lessons that we can learn from that. I know that there are, that very unique circumstances, but are there lessons that we can learn and apply to other parts of the life sciences sector, or is that truly just a one-off, unique set of circumstances?
Kathy, you probably spend more time around this than any of us, so I'll let you take a stab at that one.
It is kind of unique. I think it's a perfect example of buy the rumor, sell the news. I think as a sector, I don't know that we can do that on such a grand scale. These one-offs, maybe. I think there are a number of companies that, do that. And, I'm thinking back to my previous comments about spin. I certainly didn't mean to oversimplify the efforts of raising money. But, I think there are probably companies that would work on that same basis, buy the rumor, sell the news. But, yeah.
I think the thing that's always existed there too is everyone knew there was a timeline when the magic day was going to happen, when it was going to be legalized, right? So all your activity could time and be planned upon this magic day when everything would be legal and you'd all make $1 trillion, right? Now that fruition, now that that's happened, I think people are starting to understand that maybe the magic day wasn't as magic, but that did drive a lot of behavior. I don't think we have any one impetus in the broader therapeutics or digital health space that has that. There's a day 5 years from now when all things are going to come together and the Christmas tree is going to light up and we're all going to be super happy. So maybe that's the difference.
Maybe super happy.
And hungry.
So what I thought was interesting is you saw the report from Paradigm from Rahul Sargasser. He did an analysis on the cannabis companies and basically found that those companies that focus on recreational, which is basically the hype, were missing their targets, their revenue targets, whereas the companies that were more on the medical side were not, right? And I think that, if anything, I think that's our opportunity. Like, how do we actually take the science that we have and apply it in a field where we are right now leading and make a medical industry out of cannabis? And I personally struggle with how we do that, but I honestly think that's one opportunity we all have.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation. It's funny, we've met with a lot of these companies recently, and one of the challenges is that these guys who are medical marijuana, many of them have never brought a product to market. They know nothing about how you commercialize a medical product. And so there's a big gap between what they perceive that they're going to do and what they need to do and how they're going to get there. Somehow, if we can find a way to connect the existing expertise within companies that are already in the therapeutic space and these companies that are trying, that is an interesting opportunity. Other comments from?
No, I mean, I think your comment is bang on. I think there's a lot of moving parts as this thing is going to evolve. And I think, whether you're thinking of edibles, is it growers who are going to make edibles? Is it consumer products companies? I mean, all of this is kind of, TBD. But, I think you're absolutely right. I think there will be some connectivity between our space and growers, I think.
If there are no other questions, I think that's a wrap. Then I think it's us giving it back to Jason.